You walk into an ancient castle, stone walls cold to the touch, ceilings impossibly high, and everything feels silent, too silent. And before you even take your second step, here's the truth most people never realize. Castles were never just homes or forts. They were machines built for power, fear, and secrets. And if you think these walls only protected kings and queens, you're already missing the most disturbing part, because hidden inside castles were rooms that never appear on maps, corridors designed to confuse the human mind, and mechanisms meant to kill without mercy. And the scary thing is this: many of these secrets stayed hidden for hundreds of years, some until modern times, and some may still be undiscovered. So don't blink, because once you know this, you'll never look at castles the same way again. Now imagine you're a servant living inside one of these massive stone giants. You clean the halls, carry food, lower your head and obey. But what you don't know is that behind the wall you lean against every day could be a hollow passage where spies listen to every word you speak. Yes, castles were filled with hidden listening tunnels, narrow air channels that carried sound perfectly from one room to another. And rulers used them to spy on guests, enemies, even their own family. And here's the twist: many betrayals were discovered not by guards or soldiers, but by whispers accidentally overheard through stone. And this wasn't rare, it was intentional design. Now think about this: if castles were about protection, why would they be designed to spy on the people inside them? And that question opens a much darker door, because castles were also prisons, not always with iron bars and chains, but psychological prisons built to break the human spirit. Take dungeon cells, for example. You imagine dark rooms underground, but some castles use something worse: oubliettes, a hole in the ground, barely wider than a body, prisoners dropped in alive. No ladder, no door, no escape. Sometimes food was lowered, sometimes not. And the name itself comes from a word meaning to forget, because once you were thrown inside, the world was supposed to forget you ever existed. And here's the chilling part: some prisoners didn't die quickly. They survived for weeks, even months, alone in darkness, surrounded by rats, listening to footsteps above, knowing help would never come. And when archaeologists opened some oubliettes centuries later, they found scratch marks on the stone, fingernails worn down to bone, a final message carved in desperation. And suddenly castles stop looking romantic, don't they? But wait, because the walls themselves were weapons. Staircases inside castles were often built spiraling clockwise, not for beauty, but so that defenders coming down had full sword freedom, while attackers going up were cramped against the wall, their sword arm blocked, every step designed to disadvantage them. And that's just the beginning, because castles were full of murder holes, ceilings with hidden openings where boiling water, hot oil, or rocks could be dropped directly onto invaders. Imagine thinking you've broken through the gate, victory just one step away, and then the ceiling opens above you, and the castle itself attacks. And here's the uncomfortable truth: many attackers died without ever seeing the person who killed them. Now ask yourself how many castles were built knowing they would one day become slaughterhouses? And the answer is almost all of them. But the real secrets weren't always about war. Some were about escape. Kings and queens didn't trust anyone, not even their own guards. So castles were built with secret tunnels leading into forests, rivers, or nearby churches. Hidden exits used only in emergencies. And here's the twist: many rulers tested these tunnels during fake attacks, sacrificing soldiers just to see if escape routes worked. Power mattered more than loyalty, and sometimes those tunnels weren't for escape at all, but for secret lovers, illegal meetings, or smuggling forbidden items. And in some castles, skeletons have been found inside collapsed tunnels, people trapped forever between secrecy and stone. And then there are the rooms that make no sense: small chambers with no windows, no fireplaces, no doors at normal height. Historians still debate their purpose, but evidence suggests some were punishment rooms where nobles were locked standing up for days, unable to sit or sleep, psychological torture disguised as discipline. And castles also controlled time itself: bells, routines, curfews, meals, prayers, everything dictated by the ruler. Because when you control time, you control people, and fear was part of the design. High ceilings to make visitors feel small, narrow hallways to slow movement, echoing chambers to amplify footsteps, so you never knew if someone was behind you. And here's something rarely talked about: many castles had fake doors that led nowhere, built intentionally to confuse intruders or trap them in dead ends. And some had trap floors that collapsed, You end await, sending people into pits below. And when you realize this, castles stop being buildings and start feeling like living predators. But let's go deeper, because not all secrets were violent, some were symbolic. Castles were full of hidden symbols carved into walls, floors, and beams, symbols of secret societies, forbidden religions, or political alliances, messages hidden in plain sight, readable only to those who knew the code, and in some castles, these symbols were scratched out later, suggesting history was rewritten not in books, but in stone. And that brings us to one of the biggest secrets of all. Many castles were never meant to last, despite their massive appearance. Some were built quickly, cheaply, with poor materials, designed to intimidate rather than endure. And when wars ended or power shifted, they were abandoned, stripped, or intentionally destroyed so no one else could claim them. And here's the emotional punch. Thousands of people lived and died inside these walls believing they were eternal, unbreakable, symbols of stability. But history erased them anyway. And now for the final reveal, the thing most people never consider. Castles didn't just hide secrets, they created them. They trained humans to accept fear as normal, surveillance as protection, punishment as order, and silence as safety. And in that way, castles didn't disappear, they evolved, because the same principles, control, observation, intimidation, exist today in different forms, different buildings, different systems. And when you realize that, you understand the real secret hidden inside ancient castles isn't a tunnel or a dungeon or a trap. It's the blueprint of power itself, carved into stone centuries ago, still shaping the world we live in right now. People didn't just die inside ancient castles, many of them disappeared, quietly, completely, as if they were erased from reality. And here's the terrifying part. Sometimes no crime was ever recorded, no execution announced, no body returned. Just a name that stopped being spoken. And if you think that only happened to enemies or criminals, think again. Because castles swallowed servants, soldiers, nobles, messengers, and even children. And the reason was simple. Castles had the power to make people vanish without explanation. Now imagine you're a guard on night duty, torch in hand, walking the same corridor you've walked 100 times before. When you hear footsteps behind you, you turn. No one's there. You keep walking. And later that night, you're never seen again. No struggle, no alarm, no witnesses, and the castle goes silent like it never knew you. And this wasn't legend, it was design. Because castles were full of spaces where screams couldn't escape. Thick stone walls absorbed sound, deep chambers swallowed voices, and rulers understood this better than anyone. Now here's the first twist. Many disappearances weren't punishments. They were precautions, because information was more dangerous than weapons. Messengers carrying secrets were often killed before they finished their job. Scribes who wrote the wrong thing vanished. Servants who overheard private conversations were quietly removed, and the excuse was always the same, loyalty. But loyalty inside a castle meant silence, and silence was enforced with fear. And then there were the guests, nobles invited for feasts, alliances, weddings, arrived with banners and music and never returned home, because castles were neutral ground on the surface, but inside they were traps, halls where poison flowed more easily than wine, staircases where a single push meant death, and rooms designed so doors could be locked from the outside without leaving marks. And here's something chilling. Many of these deaths were made to look like accidents, a fall, an illness, a sudden fever, and the castle continued hosting celebrations while a body cooled behind a wall. And now imagine being a servant who notices the same noble's room, sealed off forever, guards posted, whispers spreading, and then one day the room is reopened and completely empty. Furniture gone, tapestries replaced, like no one ever stayed there. And this is where castles become truly frightening, because they didn't just remove people, they erased memory. Now let's talk about the children, because this is where history gets uncomfortable. Castles were filled with young pages, squires, noble hostages sent by families as guarantees of peace. And when alliances broke, those children became invisible prisoners, locked away, sometimes forgotten, sometimes intentionally removed to send a message. And archaeologists have found small skeletons in hidden chambers beneath castles. No records, no names, just proof that innocence didn't protect anyone. And here's the emotional twist. Some of these children grew up inside walls, never seeing daylight, taught obedience, fear, and silence. And when they were no longer useful, they vanished too. And castles had another category of people who disappeared: the inconvenient, wives who knew too much, brothers who threatened success. Scion, cousins with better claims to power, and instead of public execution, which could spark rebellion, castles offered a cleaner solution: private removal, a locked room, a sealed corridor, a journey that never began. And here's something most people don't realize. Records from medieval times show sudden gaps, names that stop appearing without explanation. And historians used to blame lost documents, but now many believe those gaps are intentional because the safest secret is one never written down. And castles specialized in that kind of silence. Now let's go deeper underground, literally, because many castles had multiple levels below the visible dungeons, secret holding spaces used only during political crises, rooms with no light, no ventilation, designed not to punish but to wait, because sometimes rulers didn't know what to do with someone yet, so they stored them like dangerous objects. And some of those people were left there for years, alive but erased. And here's the disturbing part. When power changed hands, new rulers often didn't even know who was imprisoned below them. And when those underground levels were later explored, skeletons were found chained to walls, with no identifying marks, and no idea who they were. And that's when you realize castles didn't just erase people from society, they erased them from history itself. But disappearances weren't always violent, sometimes they were voluntary, because living inside a castle could break the human mind. Servants worked endlessly, watched constantly, punished for small mistakes, and some chose to run, escaping through kitchens, tunnels, drains, and secret doors. But escape didn't mean freedom, because outside the castle walls was a world that didn't know them, didn't protect them, and often hunted them down. And many escapees were caught and returned quietly, only to vanish later for good. And here's a psychological twist. Fear inside castles was contagious. People stopped asking questions, stopped remembering faces, stopped noticing absences, because noticing meant risking becoming the next disappearance. And that silence shaped behavior for generations. And then there are the legends, stories of ghostly footsteps, crying voices, shadows at the edge of torchlight. And while it's easy to dismiss them, many of these legends align perfectly with real architectural features: hidden corridors that produce echoes, air shafts that carry sound, empty rooms that amplify whispers, and what people called ghosts were often the castle reminding them of who had vanished inside it. And here's the final truth most history books avoid. Disappearances inside castles weren't failures of justice, they were features of power. Because power doesn't need witnesses, it needs control, and castles perfected that. They created environments where people could be removed without chaos, without revolt, without explanation. And when you step back and see the pattern, the scariest realization hits. Castles train societies to accept that people can simply vanish, that silence can be normal, that authority doesn't owe explanations. And that lesson didn't stay in the Middle Ages. It survived, it adapted, it moved into new buildings, new systems, new institutions. And that's the real payoff of this story. The people who vanished inside castles weren't just victims of stone walls, they were the first casualties. Yes, of a system that learned how to erase humans without leaving scars. And once you understand that, you realize the castle never stopped existing. It just stopped looking like one. Ancient castles were not just places of war and disappearance, they were laboratories of belief and fear. And the most unsettling truth is this: behind locked doors and beneath stone floors, experiments were carried out not on animals, but on people. And no one called them experiments. They called them duty, faith, purification, or loyalty. Because when power wants to test how far it can go, it hides behind noble words, and castles were perfect for this. Isolated, guarded, unquestioned. Now imagine living inside a castle where rumors spread quietly, whispers about rooms no one entered, chambers only certain priests or scholars were allowed to access, places where torches burned at strange hours and screams were explained away as prayer. And here's the first twist. Many medieval rulers believed suffering revealed truth, that pain could expose lies, cure madness, even cleanse the soul. And castles became places where those ideas were tested. Because if someone was sick, possessed, disobedient, or simply inconvenient, they could be treated, and treatment often meant confinement, starvation, isolation, and ritualized pain. And what makes this darker is that many of these acts were fully believed to be righteous. Now step into one of these hidden rooms, stone walls carved with symbols, crosses, circles, strange markings, some religious, some older than religion itself, because castles often reused sacred ground, pagan sites, Roman ruins, and rulers believed those places held power. And here's where ritual enters the story. because many castles hosted secret ceremonies meant to protect the land, ensure victory, or secure heirs. And while history books avoid this, records show unusual animal remains buried under foundations, under thrones, under gates, offerings meant to bind the castle spiritually to its ruler. And sometimes those offerings were not animals. And before you think that sounds like legend, remember this. Builders in many regions believed a structure needed a life bound to it to stand strong, and there are documented cases of human remains found inside walls, staircases, and towers, not buried respectfully, but sealed, trapped, turned into part of the building itself. And suddenly the phrase, "the castle has bones," stops being poetic and starts being literal. Now here's the emotional turn. Some of those people were volunteers, promised protection for their family, honor in death, eternal remembrance, but their names were never recorded, their sacrifice absorbed into stone, and castles rose higher because someone never walked out again. But rituals weren't always about construction. Some were about knowledge, because castles attracted scholars, alchemists, astrologers, people searching for forbidden understanding, and rulers funded them quietly, hoping to gain power beyond armies. And these scholars experimented with herbs, chemicals, potions, and human endurance, testing limits under the excuse of medicine. And if someone died, it wasn't murder, it was research. And here's the chilling part. Many early medical techniques were tested inside castles, without consent, without records, because failure was not meant to be remembered, and servants were the easiest subjects, because servants were invisible, replaceable, and already powerless. And some survived with scars, shaking hands, broken minds, while others were quietly removed when results disappointed. And then there were the prisoners used for belief-based experiments, accused witches, heretics, traitors, people labeled dangerous not because of what they did, but because of what others feared they might be. And castles became places where belief replaced evidence, and fear replaced truth. And here's a twist most people never hear. Some castles kept detailed private journals of these acts, locked away, written in code, symbols, or shorthand, not to hide guilt, but to protect knowledge. And when those journals were discovered centuries later, many were destroyed by the discoverers themselves, because what they described was too disturbing to preserve. Now think about that. History erased not by time, but by choice, and the experiments weren't always physical. Some were psychological, isolation chambers where prisoners were kept in silence for weeks, months, sometimes years, no human contact, no sound but their own breathing, and observers noted how long it took for the mind to break, how people began talking to walls, believing shadows were real, confessing to crimes they never committed, and these techniques were later reused during interrogations, refined, perfected, and castles were the testing ground. And here's the uncomfortable realization. Many modern methods of control trace their roots back to these stone rooms. Now let's talk about religion, because castles were deeply religious places on the surface. Chapels, prayers, holy symbols everywhere. But behind that holiness was fear of damnation, and rulers believed God justified everything they did. So rituals of punishment were framed as salvation, pain as purification, and castles hosted secret exorcisms where people were beaten, starved, chained, and prayed over until they either recovered or died. And death was seen as proof that the evil was strong, not that the method was wrong. And here's a haunting detail. Some castles had special rooms with slanted floors so blood could drain easily, officially called prayer chambers, unofficially used for rituals no one wanted witnessed. And when you hear that, you realize castles were not just military structures, they were belief engines, turning fear into obedience. Now pause for a moment and imagine being a servant who cleans after these rituals, washing stone floors, scrubbing marks, never asking questions. Because asking meant becoming part of the next ceremony, and that silence allowed everything to continue. And then there's the final layer, the experiments of loyalty, because rulers tested people constantly, spreading false information to see who repeated it, staging fake betrayals, punishing random individuals to observe reactions, and castles became social experiments where fear measured obedience, and the results shaped how rulers governed, who they trusted, who they destroyed. And here's the final twist, the payoff that ties everything together. The darkest rituals and experiments inside castles were not about magic, medicine, or religion. They were about learning how to control humans completely, how to make people obey without chains, how to make silence feel safe, how to make fear feel normal, and once that knowledge was learned, it no longer needed stone walls, it could move anywhere, and that's the real secret hidden inside ancient castles. Darker than any dungeon or ritual chamber, because the castles were never just places where terrible things happened, they were classrooms where power learned how to operate without being questioned, and the people who suffered inside them were not accidents of history, they were lessons, and those lessons survived long after the castles fell.